You are crying. You know you are crying. And you know, with perfect clarity, that the thing making you cry is a drawing, not a person, not a real event. A drawing, ink and color, and the movement of light across a screen, produced by artists you have never met, about characters who do not exist and never existed, in a world that is not this world and has never been this world. And yet you are crying, and the grief is real. And when the credits roll and the screen goes dark, you sit with it for a moment because it needs to be sat with. This feeling, this strange and genuine thing that a drawing has done to you. This has happened to hundreds of millions of people. It is happening right now, somewhere, to someone who is watching a scene they have already seen before and crying at it again anyway, because knowing what is coming does not protect you from it, because the emotional logic of the story is intact, regardless of your foreknowledge, because something in the structure of the thing reaches past your defenses with a reliability that is almost embarrassing. It happened to people who swore they would never watch anime. It happened to people who dismissed it as children's entertainment, as niche obsession, as a strange foreign thing that had nothing to do with them, until it did, until it reached them through a friend's recommendation, or a late-night algorithm, or a bored afternoon. And then, it was too late. You are listening to Histomnia. If this kind of story helps you rest, consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. And let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? We love knowing who is with us in the quiet hours. And if there is a topic you would like to hear next, leave it below. Anime is the most successful storytelling format in the history of mass media that most people in the West spent decades refusing to take seriously. It began in the rubble of a defeated nation, drawn by hand in cramped apartments by artists who had survived the firebombing of their cities, and who turned to drawing as a way to process what they had seen. It grew through a television industry that was desperate for cheap content and found that animation could be produced faster and for less money than live action, and that children would watch it with an intensity that nothing else produced. It spread slowly at first, through bootleg tapes and fan translations and the underground networks of people who had found something in it that mainstream entertainment was not providing. And then, all at once, in the 90s and the 2000s, it was everywhere, in living rooms and schoolyards and university dormitories, and eventually on every streaming platform on Earth, with a global audience that numbered in the hundreds of millions, and a cultural influence that had penetrated fashion and music and art, and the fundamental visual language of the internet itself. The question that this history raises, the question that nobody quite expected to be taken seriously, is why? Why this particular form of storytelling, from this particular country, at this particular moment in history? Why does anime make people cry in ways that live-action film often does not? Why do people form attachments to animated characters that rival and sometimes exceed their attachments to real human beings? Why did a medium that was born in the specific cultural context of post-war Japan become the preferred escapism of a generation of anxious young people on the other side of the planet, in countries with entirely different languages and histories and problems? The answers involve neuroscience and economics and the specific genius of several extraordinary people and the particular way that the internet destroyed every existing distribution system and rebuilt it in a different shape. They involve a man named Osamu Tezuka, who sat in the ruins of Osaka in the 1940s and drew his way out of them. They involve a man named Hayao Miyazaki, who believed, against all commercial logic, that children deserve stories that did not condescend to them, and who turned that belief into some of the most watched films in the history of cinema. They involve the specific properties of the drawn face. Why the simplified features of an animated character activate something in the human brain that photorealistic faces sometimes do not. Why the big eyes and the fluid expressions of anime characters are not an artistic convention, but a neurological strategy evolved over decades by artists who were discovering, empirically and intuitively, how to make the human nervous system respond. They also involve you. Whatever your relationship with anime, whether you grew up with it or came to it late or have never watched it and are simply curious about why so many people care so much, you are part of this story. Because anime is not just an entertainment format. It is a mirror. It reflects something back about how human beings process emotion and find meaning and construct identity and reach across every cultural difference to connect with a story about a person who is not them in a world that is not theirs, facing problems they will never face and feel genuinely, physically, unambiguously feel that it is about them anyway. Close your eyes if you like. Let the sounds of the world around you grow quiet. Tonight we are going to follow anime from its beginning to wherever it is going. We will start in 1945, in a Japan that has just lost everything, and we will follow the story through the first television studios and the first global hits and the strange underground networks that carried anime to the West before anyone in the industry knew it was happening. We will look at the science of why it works, the neuroscience of the drawn face, the psychology of parasocial attachment, the specific emotional frequencies that animation can hit that live action cannot. We will spend time with Studio Ghibli and ask what Miyazaki understood about children and grief and the natural world that the rest of the entertainment industry was missing. We will trace the internet's role in turning a niche Japanese export into a global language. And we will try to answer the question that was waiting at the beginning. Why does a drawing make you cry? The answer, it turns out, says something important about what human beings actually need from stories and what most stories are failing to give them. Osaka in 1945 looked like the surface of the moon. The firebombing raids of March and June of that year had destroyed more than half the city. Not damaged, not scarred, but erased. The wooden buildings and paper screens and densely packed neighborhoods of one of Japan's great industrial centers reduced to ash and rubble across an area measured in square miles. The smell of burning had not entirely left the air by the time the war ended in August. The people who returned to the ruins, and most of them did return because where else was there to go, came back to a city that was also a question. What do you build, and how do you build it when everything that was here before is gone? Osamu Tezuka was 17 years old when the bombs fell on Osaka. He had spent the war years as many Japanese teenagers had, half in school, half in factories, pressed into the industrial effort of a nation that was consuming its young in the machinery of a war it was losing, he had also, throughout all of it, been drawing, not secretly. His mother had encouraged him, had recognized something in the obsessive precision with which her son filled notebook after notebook with characters and scenes and worlds that existed nowhere except in his head. He had been drawing since he was small, had been in love with the Disney films that had reached Japan before the war closed the borders, had studied the way the American animators made characters move and feel and communicate emotion through the specific vocabulary of the drawn line. What Tezuka did in the years after the war, what he produced at the age of 17 and 18 and 19 in the ruins of a defeated country, is almost impossible to account for in normal terms. He began publishing manga, the Japanese word for comics, in children's newspapers and magazines that were themselves barely surviving on rationed paper and uncertain distribution. His style was immediately distinct, influenced by Disney but not derivative of it. The characters had large, expressive eyes that conveyed emotional states with a directness that Japanese comics had not previously attempted. The stories ranged from adventure to science fiction to tragedy, and the page layouts broke every convention that existed at the time, borrowing techniques from cinema, close-ups, long shots, dramatic angles that comics artists had not yet thought to use. The readers, who were children and teenagers living in the wreckage of a war they had not started and could not understand, responded with an intensity that surprised everyone, including the publishers. Tezuka's first major work, a science fiction adventure called New Treasure Island, sold 400,000 copies in 1947, an extraordinary number for any book, an almost incomprehensible number for a country that was still rationing food. Children were sharing copies, reading them in groups, passing them around until the pages fell apart. Something in the stories was feeding a need that nothing else was feeding. The need for wonder, for escape, for a world in which the problems were comprehensible and the heroes were real, and the ending, whatever it cost to reach, was meaningful. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, because it matters for everything that follows. Anime and manga did not emerge from prosperity. They did not emerge from a culture of leisure and abundance. They emerged from devastation, from a society that had lost a war and lost its ideology and lost, in some fundamental sense, its understanding of what it was and what it was for. The people who created the first manga, who built the first animation studios, who established the visual language and the storytelling conventions that would eventually reach hundreds of millions of people around the world, were people who had experienced genuine catastrophe and who were processing it the only way available to them. By making things, by telling stories, by drawing worlds that were better or stranger or more honest than the one they were living in. This origin matters because it is visible in the work. Anime, at its best, does not flinch from loss. It does not offer the kind of resolution that American entertainment of the same period was producing. The clean victories, the uncomplicated heroes, the endings in which the world is restored to the condition it was in before the story started. Anime endings are often ambiguous. Anime heroes often fail, or succeed at costs that make the victory feel like loss, or survive something that changes them in ways that cannot be undone. This is not a stylistic choice. It is the worldview of people who knew, from direct experience, that the world does not always restore itself, that some things that break stay broken, that survival and recovery are not the same thing. Tezuka himself would go on to produce work that engaged directly with these themes, stories about war and its consequences, about the ethics of science and progress, about what it means to be human in a world that has demonstrated its capacity for inhuman violence. His most famous creation, Astro Boy, a robot child built by a grieving scientist to replace his dead son, is a story about loss and substitution and the question of what makes a being worthy of love. Questions that had particular resonance in a country that had just lost hundreds of thousands of people and was trying to understand how to grieve them. Astro Boy was also, on its surface, an adventure story for children about a robot who fights crime. Both things were true simultaneously. This capacity for operating on multiple levels at once, for being entertainment and art and cultural processing simultaneously, is one of the things that distinguished anime from the beginning, and that has never left it. By the early 1950s, Tezuka was the most famous cartoonist in Japan, and manga had become a mass medium, cheap, portable, available everywhere, read by everyone from small children to adults who had grown up with the form and had not stopped reading it when they grew up, because the stories had grown up with them. The publishing industry was producing hundreds of titles across every conceivable genre. And then, in 1953, something arrived in Japan that would change everything: the television. Japan's first television broadcasts began in February of 1953, with two stations, NHK, the public broadcaster, and what would become NTV, the first commercial network. The sets were expensive, far beyond the reach of most families in a country that was still rebuilding, and the early programming was sparse and often dull. But the medium spread with extraordinary speed, driven by the same hunger for entertainment and distraction that had made manga so successful. By the end of the decade, television ownership in Japan was growing faster than almost anywhere else on Earth, and the networks, desperate for content that was cheap to produce and reliably popular with audiences, were looking at animation with new interest. Animation was, in principle, ideal for television. It did not require expensive locations or elaborate sets or the coordination of large casts of live actors. It could be produced in a studio by a relatively small team on a schedule that television demanded, which was to say, a very fast one. The problem was that animation of the quality that audiences expected, the smooth, fluid movement of Disney films, was extraordinarily expensive and time-consuming to produce. A Disney feature film took years and hundreds of animators. A weekly television series needed new content every 7 days. The solution that the early Japanese animation studios developed, a solution that was born of necessity and that would define the visual language of anime for decades, was to animate less, where Disney used 24 frames per second, with every frame fully drawn and painted to create the illusion of smooth, continuous movement. The Japanese television studios used far fewer, sometimes as few as 8 or 12 frames per second, sometimes less. The movement was was not smooth. It was jerky, limited, stylized. Characters held still, while only their mouths moved. Action scenes cut quickly between static images rather than animating the motion. The camera moved more than the characters did. This limitation produced something unexpected. The reduced movement forced the animators to become extraordinarily expressive in other ways, in the design of the characters, in the use of color and shadow, in the moments of stillness that punctuated the action, in the faces. The faces, above all, became the site of extraordinary emotional investment. If a character could not convey feeling through fluid body movement, the face had to do everything. The eyes grew larger. The expressions became more extreme, more legible, more capable of conveying complex interior states in a single image. The visual vocabulary that we now associate with anime, the enormous eyes, the expressive faces, the moments of stylized emotional intensity, was not invented by artists who wanted to create a distinctive aesthetic. It was invented by artists who were working under severe constraints and who discovered, in the process of solving a practical problem, something that turned out to be more powerful than anything they had been trying to do. In 1963, Osamu Tezuka's studio produced the first episode of Tetsuwan Atom, known in the West as Astro Boy, for Fuji Television. It was the first weekly animated television series produced in Japan. It aired on New Year's Day. The audience numbers were extraordinary, and the industry that would eventually produce Dragon Ball and Neon Genesis, Evangelion, and Spirited Away and Attack on Titan, and every other title that has ever made a person on the other side of the world cry over a drawing had found its form. The age of anime had begun. The problem with making a weekly animated television series in 1963 was that nobody had done it before, not in Japan, not anywhere. The Disney model, the only model that existed for producing animation of any quality, was built around years of development, hundreds of artists, and budgets that bore no relationship to what a Japanese television network was willing to pay for 30 minutes of content that would air once and be forgotten. Tezuka's studio, Mushi Production, took the contract anyway, at a price that everyone in the industry understood was ruinously low, because Tezuka wanted to make the show and believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had been right about everything so far, that he could figure out how to do it. What Mushi Production developed in the months before Astro Boy's premiere was not so much a production method as a survival strategy. The limited animation techniques that the studio pioneered reduced frame rates, held cells, moving cameras over static images, close-ups that avoided showing movement entirely, were not aesthetic choices. They were the solutions of people working under impossible constraints, finding ways to produce something watchable on a schedule and budget that should have made it impossible. The animators worked extraordinary hours. Tezuka himself was known to work through the night regularly, sleeping in the studio, producing pages of storyboards that his team would then translate into animation at a pace that would have been considered insane in Hollywood. The first episode was completed days before it was due to air. Some episodes were completed hours before. The audience did not care about the frame rate. Astro Boy became the first major hit of Japanese television animation, drawing audiences of 30% or more of Japanese households in its first season. Numbers that would be extraordinary even by the standards of modern television, in a country where television was still a relatively new technology and the sets themselves were often communally shared. Children gathered around television sets in shops and community centers to watch. The character appeared on merchandise within months. The music became familiar to an entire generation. And the other studios, watching Mushi Productions' success with the careful attention of competitors who understood that something new had entered the market, began making their own shows. Toei Animation, which had been founded in 1956 with the explicit ambition of becoming the Disney of the East, had already been producing theatrical animated films, beautifully crafted, expensively made features that were critically admired and commercially respectable. The television market changed their calculations. Volume mattered now in a way it had not before. Speed mattered. The ability to produce content continuously, reliably, on a schedule that television demanded, mattered more than the perfection of any individual frame. Toei began producing television series, and in doing so, became the training ground for a generation of animators who would go on to define the medium. Among the young men who passed through Toei Animation in the 1960s were two people whose names would eventually become the most recognizable in the history of anime. Hayao Miyazaki joined Toei in 1963, the same year Astro Boy premiered, as an in-between animator, the person responsible for drawing the frames that connected the key poses that more senior animators produced. It was unglamorous work, detailed and repetitive. The entry-level position in an industry that had more ambitious young artists than it had interesting jobs for. Miyazaki was 22 years old, the son of a family that had made aircraft components during the war, a young man who had grown up with the specific guilt and confusion of a generation whose fathers had participated in something catastrophic and who had never adequately explained what they thought about it. He drew in between frames, and he watched, and he learned, and he had opinions about everything. His colleague and eventual creative partner, Isao Takahata, had arrived at Toei by a different route, through the French department of Tokyo University and a passionate interest in the French animated film The King and the Mockingbird, which he had seen in 1955 and which had, by his own account, changed his understanding of what animation could be. Takahata was not an animator. He could not draw well enough to work on the production side, but he understood storytelling with a clarity that the studio recognized as valuable, and he became a director, working with a team of animators who would realize his vision on screen. He and Miyazaki became friends and collaborators, arguing constantly about the nature of animation and its possibilities, and the gap between what was being produced and what could be produced, if only the conditions were different. The conditions were not different. The industry that was developing around them in the late 1960s and early 70s was one shaped entirely by the economics of television: fast, cheap, efficient, oriented toward children who would consume anything with a recognizable character and a catchy theme song. The studios that survived were the ones that could produce volume. The shows that got made were the ones that could sell toys. Miyazaki and Takahata worked within this system because there was no other system to work in, but they chafed against it with an energy that was creative in the way that frustration sometimes is, pushing them toward solutions, toward innovations, toward a clarity about what they actually wanted to make that they might not have reached if the industry had simply given them what they wanted from the beginning. Meanwhile, the industry itself was expanding in ways that nobody had planned. The television networks needed content, and the studios produced it, and the audiences watched it, and the system sustained itself through a feedback loop that had no natural ceiling. New genres emerged. The giant robot shows that became a defining format of the 1970s. Mecha series, in which enormous mechanical suits piloted by teenagers saved the world from alien invasion with a regularity that audiences found inexhaustible. Sports anime, in which the drama of athletic competition was rendered with an intensity that real sporting events rarely achieved. Shoujo anime, stories aimed at girls, featuring relationships and emotions and the internal lives of female characters with a seriousness that most entertainment of the period did not bother with. Each genre developed its own conventions, its own visual vocabulary, its own audience that followed it, with the devotion that genre fiction always produces in its fans. The show that changed everything, or the first show that changed everything, because there were several, was Mobile Suit Gundam, which premiered in 1979. Gundam was a mecha series, superficially, giant robots, space warfare, a young protagonist who discovers abilities he did not know he had. But the creator, Yoshiyuki Tomino, was interested in something that the genre had not previously attempted: realism, not visual realism. The robots were still enormous and improbable, but moral and psychological realism. The war in Gundam was not clean. People died, including characters the audience had been led to care about. The enemy was not evil. It was a political faction with comprehensible grievances, whose soldiers were human beings who believed in what they were fighting for. The hero made mistakes, sometimes catastrophic ones, and lived with the consequences. The show was cancelled midway through its run due to poor ratings. And then something happened that the industry did not have a framework for. The audience that had found the show, a smaller audience than the networks wanted, but a passionate one, refused to let it die. They wrote letters, they organized, they demonstrated outside the studio with handmade signs. The show was extended, completed, and then rebroadcast. And the rebroadcast drew larger audiences than the original run, because the people who loved it had been telling everyone they knew about it for months. The model kits of the show's robots, produced as merchandise always was, sold in numbers that shocked the toy companies. Gundam became a franchise that is still producing new entries more than 4 decades later, and the lesson that the industry took from it was one that would define anime's relationship with its audience going forward. The fans were not passive consumers. They were participants. They cared in a way that went beyond entertainment, beyond hobby, into something that looked more like devotion. This was new, not entirely new. People had always cared deeply about stories, had always formed communities around shared fictional worlds, but the intensity and the organization of the anime fan community that was beginning to form in Japan in the late 1970s and early 1980s was something different in degree, if not in kind. The word otaku, which originally meant simply a formal or distant way of referring to another person's household, and which had been adopted as slang for the obsessive fans of anime and manga who spent their money and their time and their identity on these things, was coined in this period. It was not initially a compliment. It described people who were seen as excessive, as having confused fiction with reality, as having invested in imaginary worlds at the expense of the real one. It would take several decades and a global shift in what counted as normal cultural behavior before the word lost most of its stigma. But the otaku, whatever anyone thought of them, were the people who kept the industry alive during its lean years, who bought the merchandise and the model kits and the art books and the soundtrack albums, who filled the conventions that began to emerge in the early 1980s, who created the fanzines and the fan fiction and the fan art that constituted, before the internet existed to give it scale, the first global anime community. They were also, as it turned out, the vanguard, the people who had discovered something that the rest of the world would eventually discover too. The early adopters of a cultural form that was still, in 1980, entirely contained within Japan, but that was already restless, already looking for a way out. The way out came from an unexpected direction, not from the studios, which were focused on the domestic market and had no particular ambition to export their work, not from the networks, which were producing content for Japanese audiences and had no framework for thinking about foreign ones. It came from the fans themselves and from a technology that was just beginning to change the world, the video cassette recorder. There is a question that people ask when they first encounter anime seriously, not the casual viewer who has seen a clip online, but the person who has sat down with a full series and felt something unexpected happen to them. And the question is, why do I care so much about a drawing? It is a reasonable question. The characters are not real. Their faces do not look like human faces. The eyes are too large, the nose is often minimal or absent, the proportions wrong in ways that a photograph would make immediately obvious. And yet, something happens in the brain when watching anime that does not happen or does not happen in the same way when watching live-action film. Something that produces attachment, investment, grief. Something that makes a person cry over ink and color in a way that a documentary about real human suffering sometimes does not. The explanation begins with a concept that the cartoonist and theorist Scott McCloud called masking. McCloud, writing about comics in the early 1990s, noticed something that seemed paradoxical. The less realistic a drawn face is, the more universally people identify with it. A photorealistic portrait is a specific person. It has particular features, a particular age, a particular ethnicity, a particular expression frozen in a particular moment. When you look at it, you look at them. A simplified cartoon face, 2 dots for eyes, a curve for a mouth, is nobody in particular. When you look at it, the brain, which is constantly and automatically searching for faces in the world and interpreting their expressions, fills in the gaps. You project yourself onto the simplified face. You become it. This is not a minor perceptual quirk. It is one of the fundamental mechanisms by which fiction works. The reason you can identify with a character whose life has nothing in common with yours, whose world is different, whose problems are different, whose species is sometimes different, is that the brain does not require realism to engage its empathy circuits. It requires legibility. It requires a face that it can read, an expression it can interpret, a set of emotional signals that it can process and respond to, and the simplified, expressive face of an anime character. Those enormous eyes, those fluid expressions, those moments of stylized intensity is, it turns out, extraordinarily legible, more legible in some respects than a real human face. The eyes are the center of this. Human beings are more sensitive to eyes than to any other feature of the face. The eyes are where we look first when we meet someone, where we look to determine emotional state, where we look to assess trustworthiness and intention and mood. The eyes of an anime character are large not because Japanese animators found large eyes aesthetically pleasing, though they did and do, but because large eyes are more expressive. They can convey more information. The pupil can dilate or contract to signal fear or excitement. The eyelids can convey dozens of distinct emotional states through their position and movement. The reflection of light in a large eye, the catchlight, the glint that signals life and presence, is visible and readable in a way that it is not in a small, realistic eye. Tezuka did not arrive at large eyes through neurological research. He arrived at them through Disney. The American animators had discovered, empirically, that audiences responded to large-eyed characters, that Bambi and Dumbo and Snow White's large luminous eyes produced warmth and identification in viewers who might otherwise have remained emotionally distant from a drawing. Tezuka saw this in the Disney films he watched as a child and teenager, absorbed it as a truth about how animation worked, and translated it into his own style, which was already more expressive and more emotionally direct than the manga that had preceded him. The artists who learned from Tezuka took it further. Each generation pushed the expressiveness of the face a little more, found ways to make the eyes convey a little more, discovered new visual languages for representing interior states that realistic faces could not show. There is research conducted in the years since neuroscience developed the tools to study these questions properly that confirms what the animators discovered by trial and error. Studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging, which measures blood flow in the brain as a proxy for neural activity, have shown that the same regions of the brain that activate when viewing real human faces also activate when viewing cartoon faces, provided the cartoon faces are expressive enough to trigger face recognition. The brain, in other words, does not distinguish as sharply between real and drawn faces as we might expect if the face is readable, if it presents the features in a configuration that the face recognition system can process. The empathy response activates. The emotional engagement is real, even when the face is not. This has implications that go beyond anime, but anime is where the implications are most visible, because anime is the medium that has most systematically developed the expressive possibilities of the drawn face. The visual vocabulary that anime uses to represent emotion is extraordinarily rich and precise. A blush that covers not just the cheeks, but the entire face, and is represented as a solid block of color. Tears that fall in streams rather than drops, representing not physical tears, but the emotional fact of crying, the feeling of it, not the appearance. Sweat drops the size of heads appearing beside a character to indicate anxiety or embarrassment. Veins pulsing at temples to indicate anger. Eyes that go flat and expressionless to indicate shock or dissociation. These are not realistic representations of what happens to human faces. They are a symbolic language for emotional states, developed over decades by artists who are solving the practical problem of how to show what a character is feeling when you cannot show it through the subtle micro-expressions of a real human face. Now, the result is a medium that, at its best, is more emotionally transparent than live action. In a film with human actors, the emotions are partly hidden behind the face. The actor is conveying something, but the translation between interior state and visible expression is incomplete, as it always is with real human beings, whose faces are not perfectly legible, whose emotions are not always what their expressions suggest, whose inner lives remain partially opaque, no matter how skilled the performance. In anime, the character's emotional state is, in the best work, completely visible. The face tells you everything. The gap between interior and exterior that makes real people so difficult to fully know is closed or greatly narrowed, and what remains is a kind of emotional directness that can feel, to a viewer accustomed to the opacity of real human interaction, almost overwhelming. This is one of the reasons that anime is particularly powerful for people who find real-world social interaction difficult, who are anxious or introverted or neurodivergent, who find the reading of real human faces exhausting or unreliable, who have been hurt by the gap between what people's faces showed and what people's faces meant. In anime, the face means what it shows. The emotional logic is consistent. The characters behave within the rules of their world in ways that are comprehensible and, eventually, predictable. Not boring, but trustworthy in a way that real people often are not. The world of the story follows rules, and the rules are legible. And within those rules, the characters are fully knowable in a way that no real person ever is. There is also color. The use of color in anime is not realistic. It is expressive in the same way that the faces are expressive. A sunset in an anime series is not a representation of what sunsets look like. It is a representation of what sunsets feel like. The particular quality of late afternoon light that carries with it associations of endings and nostalgia and the passage of time, rendered in colors that are more saturated, more dramatic, more emotionally legible than any photograph of a real sunset. A night sky is not realistic. It is covered in stars that real light pollution would have erased, rendered in a deep blue that carries the specific weight of solitude and contemplation. The natural world in anime is not the world as it is, but the world as it feels. And this distinction turns out to matter enormously to the people who watch it. Nowhere is this more true than in the work of Studio Ghibli, the studio that Miyazaki and Takahata founded in 1985, did not invent the visual language of anime. They inherited it, refined it, and in some respects transformed it into something that transcended the medium entirely. But to understand what they built and why it mattered, it is necessary to understand where they came from. The long years of frustration and compromise and failed ambition that preceded the moment when, finally, they were allowed to make exactly what they wanted to make. That moment was coming, but it was not here yet. In 1984, Hayao Miyazaki released a film called Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. It was not a Studio Ghibli film. The studio did not yet exist. It was produced by Topcraft, a small animation studio, on a budget that was modest by the standards of theatrical animation, and that Miyazaki exceeded anyway, because he always exceeded the budget, because the thing he was trying to make was always more expensive than the thing anyone had agreed to pay for. The film was based on a manga that Miyazaki had been writing and drawing for 2 years, set in a post-apocalyptic world 1,000 years after an industrial civilization had poisoned the earth, in which a young princess navigated the relationship between the remnants of humanity and the toxic jungle that had grown to replace the world they had destroyed. It was, on its surface, a science fiction adventure film for general audiences. It was also, in every frame, an argument about the natural world, about the violence that human beings do to the things they do not understand, about the possibility of a different relationship between humanity and the non-human life that shares the planet with it. Miyazaki was not subtle about this. He was never subtle. The themes of his work were always right there on the surface, visible and explicit. And what made the film's work was not the concealment of the argument, but the quality of the world he built to contain it. The extraordinary detail of the environments, the depth of the characters, the way the story earned its conclusions rather than simply asserting them. Nausicaa was a significant commercial success, and it convinced a producer named Yasuyoshi Tokuma that Miyazaki and Takahata should be given their own studio, a place where they could work without the compromises and constraints of the commercial television industry, making theatrical films on their own terms. Studio Ghibli was founded in June of 1985, named after a type of Saharan wind, and, more specifically, after an Italian reconnaissance aircraft that Miyazaki, who had been obsessed with aircraft his entire life, found beautiful. The name was chosen, Miyazaki later said, with the intention of blowing a new wind through the Japanese animation industry. This was either a statement of intent or a joke or both, depending on how you read Miyazaki, who was at this point a 44-year-old man of considerable creative frustration and very specific opinions about what animation should and should not do. The first film produced under the Ghibli name was Castle in the Sky, released in 1986. It was an adventure story, flying machines and ancient ruins, and a boy and a girl on the run from various factions who wanted something she carried. And it was extraordinary in the way that Miyazaki's best work is extraordinary. Not through any single element, but through the accumulated effect of 1,000 details, each precisely right, together, producing a world that felt more real than reality, in the specific sense that it felt more fully imagined, more completely itself, more internally consistent than the messy and incompletely realized world that most of us actually live in. Then came My Neighbor Totoro. In 1988, the studio released it as a double feature with Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies. Two films that could not have been more different, paired together in a decision that might have been a commercial miscalculation and turned out to be something else entirely. Grave of the Fireflies was an account of two children dying of starvation in the aftermath of the firebombing of Kobe in 1945. Direct, unflinching, one of the most devastating films ever made about war and its costs. Totoro was a story about two young girls moving to the countryside while their mother recovered from illness, and their encounters with enormous friendly forest spirits who may or may not exist. One was about the worst thing that had happened to Japan. The other was about a cat bus. Totoro did not perform well at the box office initially. The studio was in financial difficulty. And then something happened that is very difficult to explain in conventional commercial terms. The film found its audience through word of mouth, through parents watching it with children who then needed to watch it again, through the Totoro character appearing on the merchandise that Tokuma had commissioned as a hedge against the film's uncertain prospects, through a slow accumulation of love that built over months and years until the film was not just a film, but a permanent fixture of Japanese childhood, as inevitable and as irreplaceable as certain fairy tales. What Totoro did, and what Miyazaki's best work consistently does, is treat its audience, including its youngest audience, with complete seriousness. The film does not explain the forest spirits. It does not resolve the question of whether they are real or imagined. It does not provide the reassurance that children's entertainment typically provides, the guarantee that everything will be all right, that the danger will pass, that the adults will fix it. The mother in the film is seriously ill. The children are frightened. The world is uncertain in ways that the film does not pretend to resolve. What it offers instead is something rarer and more valuable: the sense that the world, for all its uncertainty and fear, contains things of astonishing beauty, and that the capacity to perceive those things, to see the Totoro in the forest, to ride the cat bus through the night sky, is itself a form of resilience. Miyazaki had grown up in the specific psychological aftermath of a war that had, among other things, destroyed his country's confidence in its own institutions and values. His father's factory had made aircraft components for the military. His family had been comfortable while others were dying. These were not simple facts to carry, and Miyazaki did not carry them simply. He carried them into his work, into the recurring themes of flight and guilt and complicity, and the possibility of repair that run through everything he made. But he also carried into his work a belief, stubbornly maintained against all the evidence that the 20th century had provided, that the natural world was worth protecting, and that human beings were capable of the attention and the love that protection required. Princess Mononoke, released in 1997, made this argument at full volume. Set in a mythologized medieval Japan, it told the story of a conflict between the spirits of a primeval forest and the humans. Specifically, a settlement of iron workers led by a woman named Lady Eboshi, who were destroying it. The film refused to simplify the conflict. Lady Eboshi was not a villain. She was building a community that gave dignity and employment to outcasts, lepers, former prostitutes, people who had nowhere else to go. The forest spirits were not simply victims. They were ancient and alien and capable of violence that was entirely disproportionate to any human provocation. The protagonist, Ashitaka, spent the film trying to find a resolution that would allow both sides to survive. And the film was honest enough to suggest that no such resolution was cleanly available, that the best outcome, the one the film arrived at, was not peace, but the possibility of coexistence, imperfect and ongoing, and requiring constant maintenance. It was the highest-grossing film in Japanese history at the time of its release, overtaking E.T., the extraterrestrial, which had held the record for 15 years. It was the first anime film to receive wide distribution in the United States, with a full English dub, produced by Disney, which had signed a distribution agreement with Studio Ghibli that gave the American company the right to release Ghibli films in English-speaking markets. The American release was not a major commercial success. The film was too strange, too morally complex, too unwilling to provide the resolution that American audiences had been conditioned to expect. But it reached people, and the people it reached were changed by it in ways they sometimes struggled to articulate. And they told other people, and the network of people who had seen Princess Mononoke and understood that it was doing something that other films did not do, grew quietly and persistently. 3 years later, in 2001, Studio Ghibli released Spirited Away. It is the story of a 10-year-old girl named Chihiro, whose parents are transformed into pigs by a witch who runs a bathhouse for spirits, and who must work in the bathhouse to earn enough to rescue them. It is also a story about work and identity, and the way that names, the things we are called, the things we call ourselves, shape who we are and who we can become. It is also a story about the relationship between the modern world and the ancient world that underlies it, the spirits and presences that Japanese folklore locates in rivers and mountains and old buildings, and that industrialization has displaced or ignored. It is also, at the most immediate level, a film about a frightened child doing a difficult job in a strange place, and the courage that requires, and the unexpected friendships that come from it. Spirited Away won the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2003. Miyazaki did not attend the ceremony. He had stated publicly that he opposed the American invasion of Iraq, which had begun the same week the ceremony was scheduled, and he did not feel that the occasion was appropriate for celebration. The award was accepted by a producer. The film remains, more than 2 decades after its release, the highest-grossing film in Japanese history, the most watched anime film ever made, and by most critical measures, one of the greatest films of any kind produced in the 21st century. What Miyazaki had proven over 40 years of work and struggle and argument and occasional despair was something that the industry had consistently doubted, and that he had consistently insisted on. That animation was not a lesser form of cinema, not a children's medium, not a commercial vehicle for selling toys and merchandise. It was a form capable of the full range of human experience, of grief and wonder and moral complexity and the particular beauty of the natural world rendered not as it is, but as it feels. He had proven it not by arguing, but by making film after film, each one different, and each one unmistakably his, each one adding to a body of work that was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant artistic achievements of the 20th century. And while Miyazaki was proving this in theatrical films that the whole world would eventually see, something else was happening, something quieter and stranger, and in its own way equally important. In the darkness of small apartments in Tokyo and Osaka and Kyoto, on videocassette players connected to televisions that flickered with copied images, young people were watching anime that had not been made for them, anime that the studios had produced for a domestic market and had not thought to export, anime that had found its way to these viewers through channels that were, by any strict reading of the law, illegal. They were falling in love with it. And some of them were not in Japan. In 1988, a Japanese psychiatrist named Tamaki Saito began seeing patients with an unusual profile. They were young, mostly male, intelligent, and they had stopped participating in the world, not in the depressive sense. They were not lying in bed, unable to move. They were active, engaged, deeply invested in something. The something was fiction, anime, manga, video games, the immersive fictional worlds that had become available to Japanese young people in the 1980s, with a completeness and a quality that previous generations had not had access to. These patients had not rejected the real world because they found it painful. Though some of them did find it painful, they had rejected it because they had found something better. This was not, at the time, a phenomenon that psychiatry had a framework for. The diagnostic categories that existed were designed for people who withdrew from reality because reality was intolerable. Depression, psychosis, trauma. They were not designed for people who withdrew from reality because an alternative reality was more satisfying, more comprehensible, more emotionally rewarding than the one available to them. Saito eventually described what he was seeing as a form of social withdrawal specific to the Japanese context, a condition he called hikikomori, from the Japanese words for pulling inward, and his work contributed to the recognition of a phenomenon that was, it turned out, far more widespread than anyone had realized, affecting hundreds of thousands of young people in Japan and, eventually, recognized in countries around the world. The question that Saito's patients raised, the question that the existence of hikikomori raised, was one that neuroscience was just beginning to have the tools to address. What is happening in the brain when a person forms an attachment to a fictional character? Why does the attachment feel real? Why does it produce the same emotional responses, the same warmth, the same grief when the character suffers, the same joy when the character succeeds, that real relationships produce? And why are some people more susceptible to this than others? The short answer, which neuroscience has been gradually elaborating for the past 3 decades, is that the brain does not distinguish as sharply between real and fictional social relationships as we might expect. The same neural systems that process real relationships also process fictional ones. The medial prefrontal cortex, which is involved in thinking about other people's mental states, in imagining what someone else is thinking and feeling, activates when reading about fictional characters, just as it does when thinking about real people. The mirror neuron system, which fires both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action, activates in response to depicted movement, whether the movement is performed by a real person or a drawn one. The brain, in other words, is doing the same work when you watch an anime character cry that it does when you watch a real person cry. And the emotional response that work generates is neurologically the same kind of response. This is not a malfunction. It is not a sign of confusion or immaturity or an inability to distinguish reality from fiction. It is the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do, processing social information, building models of other minds, generating emotional responses to those models, in a context that the brain did not evolve for, because the brain evolved in a world where all social information came from real people, and the existence of high-quality fictional people is a very recent development in the history of the species. The brain uses the tools it has. The tools were built for something else. They work anyway. The researcher who has done the most to map the neuroscience of this phenomenon is a social psychologist named John Cacioppo, who spent his career studying loneliness and the ways that social connection, or its absence, affects human health and cognition. Cacioppo's work established that social pain, the pain of exclusion, rejection, loneliness, activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. That loneliness is not a psychological state, but a physiological one, with measurable effects on immune function, cardiovascular health, and cognitive performance, and that the brain, when deprived of real social connection, will seek substitutes, will find ways to activate the social circuitry through whatever means are available, including fictional ones. This is why parasocial relationships, the one-sided relationships that people form with celebrities, fictional characters, and media personalities, are not pathological. They are adaptive. They are the brain solving a problem, the problem of social need in the absence of adequate social connection, using the materials at hand. The term parasocial was coined in the 1950s by the sociologists Donald Horton and Richard Wall to describe the relationships that television audiences formed with television personalities. And it was originally used with a slightly clinical edge, as if there was something slightly embarrassing about caring about someone who did not know you existed. The neuroscience suggests that the embarrassment was misplaced. The relationship is real in all the ways that matter neurologically. The fact that it is not reciprocated does not make the brain's response to it less genuine. Anime is unusually effective at producing parasocial attachment for reasons that are now fairly well understood. The serialized format, episodes released weekly or binged over days rather than experienced as a single 2-hour film, means that the viewer spends more time with the characters than any film could provide. A long-running anime series might involve 100 hours of time spent in the company of the same characters, watching them face different challenges, develop over time, form relationships with each other, change. The emotional investment that accumulates over 100 hours of shared experience is substantial. It is, in terms of time and attention, comparable to the investment one makes in a real friendship. The emotional transparency of anime characters, the way their inner states are visible on their faces, the way the visual language of the medium makes concealment difficult, means that the viewer knows these characters in a way that is, paradoxically, more complete than the way we know most real people. Real people are opaque. Their faces do not always accurately represent their interior states. They have reasons for concealment, habits of self-protection, layers of social performance that stand between their inner lives and the world. Anime characters, in the best work, have none of this. Their grief is visible. Their joy is visible. Their fear and their love and their confusion are all there, on the surface, rendered in a visual language that the viewer has learned to read as fluently as spoken language. And then there is dopamine, the neurotransmitter that is most associated with reward and anticipation, not with pleasure exactly, but with the prediction of pleasure. The expectation of something good is deeply involved in what happens when a person watches a well-constructed narrative. The brain, confronted with a story, is constantly making predictions. What will happen next? What the character will do? How the situation will resolve? When those predictions are confirmed, dopamine is released. When they are confounded, when the story does something unexpected that nevertheless feels, in retrospect, inevitable, dopamine is released in a larger pulse. The brain is, in the most literal neurological sense, rewarded for paying attention to narrative. Anime is unusually skilled at managing this dopamine loop. The episode structure, the cliffhanger ending that leaves a question unresolved, the next episode preview that shows just enough to generate anticipation without satisfying it, is a machine for producing the specific neurological state of wanting to know what happens next. The long character arcs that span entire series create investments that pay off over dozens of hours, producing the particular satisfaction of a promise kept. The story told you this character would grow, and it kept the promise, and the moment of resolution triggers a dopamine response that is proportional to how long the anticipation was sustained. The unexpected deaths of beloved characters, a technique that anime uses with less hesitation than most Western entertainment, produce grief that is neurologically real, and grief, paradoxically, deepens attachment. The characters who die in anime are often the ones most vividly remembered. There is something else, harder to quantify but important. Anime, at its best, takes emotional experience seriously in a way that a great deal of popular entertainment does not. It does not rush past grief, or minimize suffering, or guarantee that everything will be all right. It sits with difficult emotions, with loneliness and failure, and the specific pain of being a young person in a world that does not yet make sense, and treats them as worthy of full attention. For people who feel that their emotional experience is too intense, or too complex, or too strange to be validated by the mainstream culture around them, this can be the quality that matters most, not the action sequences or the beautiful animation or the catchy music, but the simple fact of a story that looks at what you are feeling and says, yes, this is real. This is worth taking seriously. the word that keeps appearing in accounts of why people love anime, in the interviews and the forum posts, and the personal essays that people have written about what the medium has meant to them, is understood, not entertained, not distracted, understood. The sense that a story has seen something true about your experience and rendered it faithfully. That the character on screen is not just a fictional person but a mirror. That the emotions you have been carrying in private have been given form and weight and dignity by someone who is paying attention. This is, when you think about it, what all the greatest literature has always tried to do. Anime did not invent it, but anime, for a generation of people who came to it at the right moment, who were at the age when identity is still forming and the need for mirrors is most acute, delivered it with a consistency and an accessibility that other forms of storytelling had not. While all of this was happening inside the brains of Japanese viewers, something else was happening outside Japan, something slow and underground and driven entirely by people who had no official support and no commercial infrastructure and nothing but a desire to share something they loved with people who did not yet know they needed it. The global spread of anime was not planned. It was not the result of a strategy. It was the result of obsession, and the particular way that obsession in the pre-internet era found the people it needed to find. In 1982, a 14-year-old boy in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, walked into a video rental store and found something he did not have a name for. It was a video cassette, its label handwritten in English over what was clearly a Japanese original, its cover showing a robot and a young pilot, and an explosion rendered in a visual style he had never seen before. Not Disney, not Hanna-Barbera, not any of the Saturday morning cartoons he had grown up with. He rented it. He watched it. He watched it again. And then he spent the next several months trying to find more of whatever it was. This story, or versions of it, was happening in dozens of cities across the United States and Europe in the early 1980s. The mechanism was always roughly the same. A Japanese student or businessman living abroad had brought tapes from home, or a video rental store in a neighborhood with a significant Japanese immigrant population had stocked them as a service to that community, and someone outside that community had wandered in, or an American serviceman who had been stationed in Japan had come home with a collection and had shown it to a friend. The tapes were in Japanese, unsubtitled, and the people who watched them often did not speak Japanese and did not need to. The visual storytelling was clear enough, the emotional logic was legible enough, that language was a secondary consideration. What happened next was one of the more remarkable grassroots cultural phenomena of the late 20th century. The people who had found these tapes, who had watched unsubtitled Japanese animation and felt something happen to them that they could not account for, began creating the infrastructure that would eventually bring anime to the world. They formed clubs, first at universities, then in communities, gathering in living rooms and rec centers to watch tapes together. They learned Japanese, not necessarily to fluency, but enough to follow a story. Or they found members of the group who could translate in real time, providing a running commentary as the tape played. And then, As the technology improved and the cost of the equipment fell, they began making subtitles. Fansubbing, the practice of creating unofficial subtitle translations of Japanese animation and distributing them on videocassette, was technically illegal from the beginning. The studios that owned the anime had not licensed it for foreign distribution. The fans who were translating and dubbing and copying and distributing it had no legal right to do any of those things. They did them anyway, with a commitment and a rigor that was, in its way, extraordinary. The best fan-subbing groups maintained translation standards that professional localization companies would later struggle to match, debating the correct rendering of cultural references and wordplay and honorifics, with the seriousness of scholars arguing about a text they believed mattered. The studios in Japan were aware that this was happening, and their response was, for the most part, to ignore it. The foreign market was not a market they were trying to reach. The people making the tapes were not taking money from anyone because there was no legitimate product to buy. And the fansubbers, for their part, operated under an informal code that most of them honored. When a title received an official English release, the fan translation was retired. The whole enterprise was understood by everyone involved as a temporary solution to the absence of a legitimate market. Not piracy for profit, but something closer to cultural evangelism, the passionate desire to share something extraordinary with people who did not yet know it existed. The first major breakthrough into mainstream Western consciousness came from an unexpected direction. In 1978, a Japanese anime series called Battle of the Planets had been licensed for American television, heavily edited, redubbed, with new footage added to replace scenes that the American network considered too violent or too strange for young audiences. The original series, called Science Ninja Team Gatchaman, was largely unrecognizable in its American form, but something survived the translation, something in the visual design, in the energy of the action sequences, in the character dynamics, that found an audience. Children who watched Battle of the Planets in the late 1970s were, without knowing it, watching anime. Some of them would spend the next decade trying to find where that feeling had come from. Then came Robotech in 1985. 3 separate Japanese series edited together into a single 85-episode American series, with a new overarching storyline imposed on the combination. Like Battle of the Planets, Robotech was heavily modified from its Japanese originals. Unlike Battle of the Planets, it retained something that American children's animation of the period almost never had: consequence. Characters died in Robotech. Relationships developed over time and mattered to the plot. The war that the series depicted was long and costly and left marks on the people who fought it. American children who watched Robotech experienced, for perhaps the first time, an animated series that treated them as capable of handling complexity and loss, and many of them never forgot it. But the event that changed everything, that took anime from a passionate underground phenomenon to a genuinely global one, was Dragon Ball Z. The series, based on Akira Toriyama's manga and originally airing in Japan from 1989, reached American television in 1996 in a dubbed version that was, like its predecessors, edited and modified for an American audience. It was not, by any strict aesthetic measure, among the best anime ever made. The pacing was notorious. Fight sequences that lasted minutes in the manga were extended to fill multiple episodes. Characters powered up for so long that the powering up became a format in itself, a kind of ritual that the audience understood and participated in rather than simply watched. It was also, to the children and teenagers who watched it in the late 1990s, absolutely transfixing. Dragon Ball Z had something that very little children's entertainment of the period had: stakes. Real stakes, with real consequences. Characters who had been in the story for years died and stayed dead and were mourned. The heroes lost, not temporarily, not as a minor setback to be overcome in the next episode, but genuinely, humiliatingly, with real cost. The villains were powerful in ways that made the eventual victories meaningful. The emotional investment that the series demanded was proportional to the emotional payoff it provided, and the children who grew up with it developed, through the experience of watching it, an appetite for storytelling that took them seriously, that did not manage their emotions down to a safe level, but allowed them to feel the full weight of what was happening. Pokémon arrived in America in 1998 and did something different. Where Dragon Ball Z had been intense and emotionally demanding, Pokémon was accessible, lighter in tone, more episodic, built around a concept that was infinitely extensible and that translated effortlessly across cultural boundaries. The idea of a child traveling through a world filled with creatures that could be caught and trained and battled required no cultural context to understand. It was universal in the way that the best game concepts are universal, immediately comprehensible, endlessly variable, capable of generating attachment to individual creatures that was disproportionate to their objective complexity. The Pokémon phenomenon, the anime, the games, the cards, the merchandise, became one of the most successful media franchises in history, generating more revenue than Star Wars or Marvel or any other intellectual property ever created. And then, just as Dragon Ball Z and Pokémon were establishing anime as a legitimate commercial category in Western markets, something happened that made all the commercial infrastructure irrelevant. The internet arrived, and with it, a transformation in the relationship between anime and its global audience that nobody in the industry had anticipated, and that the industry spent the better part of a decade trying, unsuccessfully, to contain. The fansubbers who had been distributing their translations on videocassette through networks of a few thousand dedicated fans suddenly had access to a global distribution system that cost nothing and reached everywhere. The process that had taken months, translating a series, recording the subtitles, copying the tapes, mailing them to subscribers, compressed to days and then to hours. A series that aired in Japan on a Tuesday might have English subtitles available online by Thursday. The audience that had been limited by the physical constraints of cassette distribution, by the cost of blank tapes and postage, and the patience required to wait weeks for something to arrive, was suddenly unlimited. Anyone with a computer and an internet connection could watch anything. The generation that came of age in the early 2000s was the first generation to grow up with this access. They watched Neon Genesis Evangelion and Cowboy Bebop and Full Metal Alchemist and Naruto. Not because a television network had decided these were appropriate for export, not because a licensing deal had been struck and a dub produced and a time slot assigned, but because someone had put them online and they had found them in the particular way that things are found on the internet, through a recommendation from a friend or a forum post, or an algorithm that identified them as similar to something else they had liked. The intermediaries had been removed. The gatekeepers were gone. The audience and the content were in direct contact for the first time. What happened next is the story of how a medium went from underground phenomenon to global dominance, and of what that dominance revealed about what people everywhere, in every cultural context, actually needed from their stories. In 2006, a 23-year-old in São Paulo sat down at a computer that was connected to the internet through a dial-up modem that cost more per hour than he could comfortably afford, and watched the first episode of a series called Death Note. He had found it through a forum, a text-based discussion board dedicated to Japanese animation, populated by people he had never met and would never meet, scattered across a dozen countries, united by the specific kind of passion that finds people who share it and pulls them together, regardless of geography. The subtitles were in English, which was his second language. The animation was Japanese, which was a language he did not speak at all. None of this mattered. He watched until the dial-up cut out. He paid for more time. He watched the rest. This scene, or something like it, was happening simultaneously in Lagos and Moscow, and Jakarta and Cairo and Buenos Aires and Seoul and 100 other cities whose residents had no particular reason, from a conventional cultural standpoint, to care about Japanese animation. The internet had done something that no distribution deal, no licensing arrangement, no commercial strategy could have achieved. It had made the gatekeepers irrelevant. For the first time in the history of mass media, a piece of content could travel from its place of origin to any person on Earth who wanted it, without passing through any of the intermediary institutions, the studios, the broadcasters, the distributors, the retailers that had previously controlled what reached whom and when. The anime industry in Japan was not prepared for this. The studios had been producing content for a domestic market, with foreign sales as a secondary consideration, a source of additional revenue rather than a strategic priority. The legal framework for protecting intellectual property across international borders was, in the early 2000s, inadequate to the speed and scale of digital distribution. By the time any individual studio had identified a series being distributed without authorization, found legal counsel in the relevant jurisdictions, and begun the process of pursuing a takedown, the series had been downloaded millions of times, and the audience that had watched it had moved on to the next one. The enforcement game was unwinnable, and most of the studios eventually stopped trying to win it, focusing instead on the question of how to convert the enormous, unauthorized audience that the internet had created into a legitimate commercial one. The answer, when it came, was Netflix, or not Netflix specifically. The answer was streaming, the model of unlimited access for a monthly subscription fee that Netflix pioneered and that every other major media company eventually adopted. Streaming solved, for the anime industry, the problem that piracy had made visible. The audience existed. It was enormous and global, and it was willing to pay for access if access was easy and affordable and immediate. The friction that had driven people to unauthorized sources, the delay between Japanese broadcast and Western release, the limited selection available through official channels, the high price of physical media, could be eliminated if the content was available legally on the day of broadcast in every market for a reasonable monthly fee. Crunchyroll, which had begun in 2006 as what was effectively a piracy platform before negotiating legitimate licensing deals with Japanese studios, pioneered the simultaneous release model, simulcasting in the industry's terminology, that made this possible. A series airing in Japan would be subtitled and available on Crunchyroll within hours of broadcast in every country where the service operated. The lag that had driven Western fans to unofficial sources was eliminated. The selection was comprehensive. The price was, by the standards of other entertainment subscriptions, modest. The unauthorized distribution did not disappear. It never entirely disappears, but it shrank because the legitimate alternative was now genuinely better. Netflix entered the anime market with its characteristic aggression, beginning in 2017, to commission original anime productions rather than simply licensing existing ones. The budgets that Netflix brought to these productions were, by the standards of the anime industry, extraordinary. The industry had survived for decades on margins so thin that the working conditions for animators, particularly junior animators, were notoriously poor, with salaries that placed entry-level positions among the lowest paid skilled jobs in Japan's creative economy. Netflix money changed the calculations, at least for the studios it worked with, and the productions it commissioned reflected the increased resources. More fluid animation, more elaborate environments, production values that approached the theatrical films that the industry's best work had always been capable of, but that the economics of television had rarely permitted. The shows that defined the streaming era of anime were different from their predecessors in ways that reflected the changed audience. Attack on Titan, which began in 2013 and became one of the most watched anime series in history, was structured less like a television series than like an extended novel, a single continuous narrative dense with foreshadowing and callback and thematic development that demanded and rewarded the kind of close sustained attention that the binge-watching model made possible. Demon Slayer, whose first season released in 2019, combined a story of devastating loss and familial devotion with animation that was, in several sequences, technically as accomplished as anything the industry had ever produced. The Hinokami Kagura sequence in episode 19 generating more discussion and more emotional response than almost any other single scene in the history of the medium. The global audience that had assembled around anime by the early 2020s was unlike any fan community that had preceded it. The fansubbers of the 80s and 90s had been a few thousand people, scattered and underground, connected by mail and early internet forums. The streaming audience was tens of millions of people in every country with a reliable internet connection, discussing what they had watched in real time across social media platforms that had been designed without any particular intention to be perfect vehicles for the kind of passionate communal engagement that anime produced. A new episode of a major series would generate millions of social media posts within hours of release. The conversation was global and simultaneous and conducted in dozens of languages, unified by the shared experience of the same story. Something else was happening in this period that was equally significant and less commercially visible: the vocabulary of anime, the visual language, the storytelling conventions, the specific aesthetic choices that had developed over 70 years of Japanese animation was migrating into the broader culture. The large expressive eyes of anime characters appeared in Western animation and in video games and in advertising. The narrative structures, the long character arcs, the willingness to let heroes fail, the treatment of death as something with permanent consequences, influenced the writers' rooms of American prestige television. The music, the soaring orchestral scores, the emotionally loaded opening and ending themes found its way into the playlists of people who had never watched anime and did not know where the sounds had come from. The internet had done for anime what it eventually did for everything: dissolved the boundaries between the place where something was made and the place where it was consumed, accelerated the movement of cultural influence in all directions simultaneously, and created the conditions for a genuinely global pop culture in which the dominant forms were no longer exclusively American. Anime was not the only beneficiary of this dissolution. Korean popular music, Bollywood cinema, British television had all found global audiences through similar mechanisms. But anime was the earliest and, in terms of sustained global impact, the most thoroughgoing example of what happened when you removed the gatekeepers and let the audience decide. The audience had decided, and what they had decided consistently and across every demographic and every cultural context was that they wanted stories that took their emotions seriously, that trusted them to handle complexity, that rendered the interior life of their characters with honesty and precision. They wanted, in other words, exactly what anime had been providing since Osamu Tezuka sat in the ruins of Osaka and began to draw. But the question of why this particular hunger? Why this particular moment? Why the generation that came of age in the first decades of the 21st century turned to anime with such consistent intensity? That question had an answer that went beyond distribution models and streaming economics. It had to do with what was happening to that generation and what they needed and what everything else on offer was failing to give them. In 2012, a researcher at San Diego State University named Jean Twenge published a paper with a title that, at the time, seemed mildly provocative, and that, in retrospect, looks like the beginning of an important conversation. The paper documented a significant increase beginning around 2012 in rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness among American teenagers, an increase that coincided with a precision that was difficult to dismiss as coincidental with the widespread adoption of smartphones and social media platforms. Twenge called the generation born after 1995 iGen and later Generation Z, and she described them as the first generation to grow up with smartphones as a permanent feature of adolescence, connected to a global social network from early childhood, exposed to a continuous stream of information and comparison and performance that previous generations had not experienced. The mental health data that followed Twenge's initial work was, and continues to be, alarming. Rates of diagnosed anxiety disorders among young people in the United States increased by 32% between 2007 and 2012, and have continued to rise since. Rates of depression among teenagers increased by 63% between 2007 and 2017. Emergency room visits for self-harm among girls aged 10 to 14 more than tripled in the same period. Similar trends appeared in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Canada, in countries across the developed world with different cultural contexts and different social safety nets and different relationships with technology, but with the same smartphones and the same social media platforms and, apparently, the same effects. The causes of this crisis are disputed and probably multiple. The smartphone hypothesis is compelling but contested, and the data on what exactly is driving the increase in youth mental health problems is complex enough that honest researchers differ significantly in their interpretations, but the experience of the generation at the center of it is not contested. Young people, in surveys and in the kind of unguarded online spaces where people say what they actually think, describe a world that feels overwhelming, a social environment that feels performative and exhausting, a future that feels uncertain in ways their parents' futures did not. They describe loneliness, not the loneliness of isolation, because they are more connected in the technical sense than any generation before them, but the loneliness of surfaces, of interactions that are numerous and frictionless and somehow insufficient, that do not provide the depth of connection that human beings need. This is the generation that watches anime. Not exclusively, anime's audience spans generations, and some of its most devoted fans are in their 30s and 40s and older. But the generation that drove the streaming explosion of the 20-teens and 2020s, that turned Demon Slayer and Attack on Titan and My Hero Academia into global phenomena, that built the social media communities around anime that generate millions of posts per day. This is largely a generation of anxious young people who found in anime something that the world around them was not providing. What they found was, in the first place, emotional honesty. The social media environment that many of them had grown up in was, by its nature, a space of performance, carefully curated presentations of the self, edited to show the best and hide the worst, generating a continuous anxiety about whether the presented self was adequate, whether the numbers were good enough, whether the performance was landing. Anime, in its best work, is the opposite of this. The characters do not perform. Their emotional states are visible. Their failures are real. Their grief is shown rather than managed. For a generation that had grown up in a world of performed emotions, the unperformed emotions of anime characters could feel, paradoxically, more real than the real people around them. What they found was also, and this is harder to articulate but important, a different relationship with time. The social media environment moves fast. The news cycle is continuous. The content is inexhaustible. The expectation is that attention will move from one thing to the next with a speed that mirrors the speed at which the platform delivers new stimulation. Anime, even streaming anime watched at any speed you choose, is built on a different temporal logic. The long series demand sustained attention. The slow episodes, the quiet moments between action sequences, the conversations that develop character rather than advance plot, require a willingness to stay, to not skip ahead, to allow the story to move at its own pace. For young people whose attention had been shaped by platforms designed to maximize engagement by maximizing novelty, this slower pace was not a frustration, but a relief, a permission to settle, to invest, to care about something for longer than the average social media post demanded. The concept of isekai, the genre of anime in which the protagonist is transported from the ordinary world into a fantasy world, usually one with the structure of a video game, deserves particular attention here. Isekai became, in the 2010s, one of the most popular genres in anime, generating hundreds of series and a devoted global audience. The appeal is not difficult to analyze. The protagonist, typically a young person who is ordinary or unsuccessful or miserable in the real world, is removed from that world and placed in one where their skills are valued, where they have clear goals, where progress is measurable, where they matter. It is escapism in the most literal sense, a narrative about escape from a world that feels inadequate to a world that makes sense. The critics of isekai, and there are many, including within the anime community, argue that the genre is wish fulfillment at its most transparent, that it offers its audience not the challenge of genuine art, but the comfort of a flattering fantasy. This criticism is not wrong as far as it goes, but it misses something important about why wish fulfillment matters and what it is fulfilling. The wish that isekai fulfills is not the wish to be powerful or admired, though those elements are present. It is, at its core, the wish to be in a world that makes sense, a world where effort leads to improvement, where rules are consistent, where the social dynamics are legible, where you can know what you are supposed to do and do it, and have it matter. This is not a trivial wish. It is a response to a specific experience of the real world as chaotic, arbitrary, and resistant to individual effort in ways that previous generations' experience of the world was not, or at least did not feel like. The deeper anime, the work that is not escapism but something harder and more valuable, does something different. It does not offer a better world. It offers a way of seeing this world more clearly. Neon Genesis Evangelion, which aired in 1995 and which has retained its power across 3 decades and multiple reformulations, is a story about a 14-year-old boy who is asked to save the world and who is not, in any meaningful sense, capable of it, who is depressed and avoidant and desperately in need of connection and completely unable to accept it, who sits in the cockpit of a giant robot and cannot make himself fight, who wants to be held and is afraid of being held, whose psychology is rendered with a clinical precision that was, at the time, unprecedented in popular animation. The show does not resolve his problems. It does not offer him or the audience a way out. What it offers instead is recognition, the feeling of being seen in the specific texture of one's dysfunction, of having the interior experience of depression and anxiety, and the particular loneliness of being unable to connect rendered faithfully and without judgment. For the generation that encountered Evangelion in the streaming era, often in their teens or early 20s, often at a point when their own mental health was fragile, often alone in a room with a screen at 2 a.m, this recognition was sometimes the most important thing they had felt in months. Not entertainment, not distraction, the specific relief of feeling understood by something. This is why the question of whether anime is good for the young people who watch it, a question that parents and educators and psychologists have been asking since the medium became a global phenomenon, does not have a simple answer. For some people, anime is escapism in the pejorative sense, a way of avoiding the real world, rather than engaging with it. For others, it is the opposite, a way of processing the real world, of finding language for experiences that the real world does not provide language for, of feeling less alone in difficulties that the surrounding culture insists on minimizing or ignoring. The medium is not the message. What matters is the relationship between the viewer and the work, and that relationship is as various and as individual as the people who form it. What is clear is that the generation that grew up with streaming anime is, in significant ways, a generation that grew up with anime as a primary cultural reference, a shared language, a set of stories and characters and emotional experiences that form part of the common ground between people who might otherwise have very little in common. When two people who have both watched the same series meet, they share something that is difficult to name, but that is real, a set of emotional experiences, a collection of moments that mattered, a way of talking about inner states that the series provided a vocabulary for. This is what popular culture has always done. Anime does it with particular efficiency because the emotional intensity of the form means that the experiences it provides are more vivid, more memorable, more deeply encoded than the experiences that blander entertainment provides. The question that remains, the question that was posed at the beginning of this story, and that all of this history has been building toward, is the one that was always really being asked. Not why anime is popular, not how it spread, but why a drawing makes you cry, why the grief is real, what that grief is about, and what it says, and what it means that a medium born in the ruins of a defeated nation has become the primary emotional language of a generation on the other side of the world. The answer is in the last block, and it is, in its way, a kind of comfort. There is a scene in a Studio Ghibli film called Grave of the Fireflies, Takahata's film, the one that played as a double feature with Totoro in 1988, in which a 14-year-old boy opens a tin of fruit drops and finds it empty. And the emptiness of the tin is the most devastating thing in the film. More devastating than any of the deaths that preceded, because the tin had been full at the beginning of the story, and its emptying is a perfect measure of everything that has been lost. The boy looks at the empty tin. That is all. Takahata does not underline it. He does not add music. He simply shows you the empty tin and trusts you to understand what it means, which you do completely and immediately, because the film has earned that understanding over the preceding hour and a half. This is not a trick. It is not a manipulation. It is storytelling at the level of genuine art, the creation of a context in which a simple image carries an enormous weight, in which the specific and the universal collapse into each other, in which an empty tin of fruit drops becomes a measure of all the things that cannot be recovered. The grief you feel watching it is your grief, grief you already had, for things in your own life that are gone, that cannot come back, that you have been carrying without a form to put them in. The film gives you the form. The relief of having the form is part of what feels like grief. This is the answer to the question that has been waiting since the beginning. Why does a drawing make you cry? Because the drawing is not really about the drawing. It is about you. It is about the specific emotional experiences that you have been carrying, some of them for years, some of them since childhood, some of them so old that you have stopped recognizing them as grief and have simply incorporated them into the background texture of your life. A low, persistent weight, a reluctance to think about certain things, a tendency to feel more than you can explain in situations that should not affect you that much. Art does this, literature does this, and music does this, and film does this. Anime does it with a particular efficiency and reach because of the specific properties of the medium, the emotional transparency of the drawn face, the length and depth of the serial format, the willingness to engage with loss and failure, and the interior experience of being a person in a difficult world without flinching or managing the emotion down to a safe level. But the mechanism is the same mechanism that has always made art matter. The recognition, the moment when something outside you reflects something inside you with enough precision that the two things briefly coincide. And in that coincidence, there is a release of something that has been held too long. The people who built anime, Tezuka in his cramped apartment in the ruins of Osaka, Miyazaki in the production rooms of Toei Animation arguing about everything, the fansubbers in their living rooms with their videocassette decks, the young animators working impossible hours in studios that paid them almost nothing, were not building an entertainment industry. They were building a language for the interior life, for the things that are felt but not easily said, for the experiences that mainstream culture tends to minimize or ignore, for the grief and the wonder and the specific quality of longing that is part of being a conscious creature in a world that is beautiful and painful and difficult to understand. The fact that this language was built in Japan in the specific historical context of defeat and reconstruction and the particular cultural inheritance of a society that had developed its own rich traditions for expressing interior states through art and ritual and the careful attention to natural beauty. This was not incidental. The Japanese aesthetic tradition, which includes the concept of mono-no-aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the gentle sadness of things that pass, is visible everywhere in anime, in the attention to the quality of light at different times of day, in the treatment of seasons as emotional registers, in the willingness to let a story end in a way that is not triumphant but is true. The medium carries its origins, even when the story is set in a fantasy world. with no connection to Japan. The emotional sensibility that shapes it came from somewhere, was formed by something, carries the weight of a particular history. And yet it reached everywhere. It reached the 14-year-old in Portland in 1982 and the 23-year-old in Sao Paulo in 2006, and the teenager in Lagos watching Full Metal Alchemist on a phone with a cracked screen in 2018, and the insomniac in whatever city you are in right now, listening to this in the quiet hours, carrying whatever you are carrying. It reached them because the things it was talking about, loss, identity, the difficulty of connection, the possibility of growth, the question of what makes a life worth living, are not Japanese questions. They are human questions. They are the questions that every person in every culture, in every period of history has been trying to answer, and the answers are never final, and the asking never stops. The drawing makes you cry because you are a person who has loved things and lost them, or feared losing them, or not yet had them and already feel the shape of the absence, because you are a person who has been lonely in the specific way that loneliness is felt in a world of constant connection. Not the absence of people, but the presence of people who do not quite see you, or who see only the surface, or who you cannot show the interior of yourself to without risk, because you are a person who needed at some point to feel that the difficulty of being you was real and serious and worth taking seriously, and most of the world was too busy or too uncomfortable to confirm that. The drawing confirmed it. That is all. That is everything. There is a concept in Japanese called ame, the pleasurable dependence on another's benevolence, the feeling of being held by something outside yourself, of being allowed to be small and uncertain in the presence of something that will not judge you for it. It is a concept that does not translate perfectly into English, which may be why English-speaking cultures have found it easier to feel than to name. But it describes something that happens when you watch a story that sees you, a relaxation, a letting down of the performed self, a permission to feel what you actually feel rather than what you are supposed to feel. The story holds you. You do not have to hold yourself quite so tightly for a while. This is what Tezuka was doing in the ruins of Osaka, not building an industry, not creating an aesthetic movement, not founding a tradition that would eventually reach hundreds of millions of people. He was drawing because drawing was the thing that made the world bearable, because the worlds he could create on paper were more comprehensible than the world he was living in, because the act of making something, anything, was a way of insisting that the future existed and was worth imagining. He was 17 years old, and the city he had grown up in was ash and rubble, and he sat down and drew, and the drawing was a form of hope. All of anime is, in some sense, that drawing. All of it carries, somewhere in its DNA, the insistence that the future exists and is worth imagining, that the interior life is real and worthy of attention, that the grief and the wonder and the longing that a person carries through the world are not embarrassments to be managed, but human experiences to be honored. The medium has produced a great deal of content that is merely commercial, that is cynical, that is badly made and emotionally dishonest. Every medium produces those things. but at its best, at the level of Takahata's empty tin, of Miyazaki's Light on the Water, of the moment in Evangelion when Shinji finally accepts being held, of the 1,000 other moments that have stopped the breath of people watching alone in the dark. Anime does what the greatest art has always done. It says, "You are not alone in this. Someone was paying attention. Someone made this for you, even though they did not know you, even though you were born in a different country and speak a different language and have a different history. They made this for you because the thing they were trying to say about being a person in the world is the same thing you needed to hear." That is why the drawing makes you cry, not because of the drawing, because of what the drawing knows about you. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the sounds of the world grow quiet around you. Somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in the dark, watching a story unfold on a screen, and something is happening to them that they will carry for the rest of their life. The drawing is moving, the music is playing, the character on the screen is feeling something, and the person watching is feeling it too. And in that shared feeling, across every distance, across every difference, across the impossible gap between a drawn line and a human heart, something is being understood. Good night. Sleep well.